Chapter 3 of Woman and the New Race by Margaret Sanger. The Materials of the New Race. Each of us has an ideal of what the American of the future should be. We have been told times without number that out of the mixture of stocks, the intermingling of ideas and aspirations, there is to come a race greater than any which has contributed to the population of the United States. What is the basis for this hope that is so generally indulged in? If the hope is founded upon realities, how may it be realized? To understand the difficulties and the obstacles to be overcome before the dream of a greater race in America can be attained is to understand something of the task before the woman who shall give birth to that race. What material is there for a greater American race? What elements make up our present millions? Where do they live? How do they live? In what direction does our national civilization bend their ideals? What is the effect of the melting pot upon the foreigner once he begins to melt? Are we now producing a freer, juster, more intelligent, more idealistic, creative people out of the varied ingredients here? Before we can answer these questions, we must consider briefly the races which have contributed to American population. Among our more than 100 million population are Negroes, Indians, Chinese, and other colored people to the number of 11 million. There are also 14,500,000 persons of foreign birth. Besides these, there are 14 million children of foreign-born parents and some 6,500,000 persons whose fathers or mothers were born on foreign soil, making a total of 46 million people of foreign stock. 50% of our population is of native white strain. Of the foreign stock in the United States, the last general consensus, compiled in 1910, shows that 25.7% was German, 14% was Irish, 8.5% was Russian or Finnish, 7.2% English, 6.5% Italian, and 6.2% Austrian. The abstract of the same consensus points out several significant facts. The Western European strains in this country are represented by a majority of native-born children of foreign-born or mixed parentage. This is because the immigration from those sources has been checked. On the other hand, immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, including Russia and Finland, increased 175.4% from 1900 to 1910. During that period, the slums of Europe dumped their submerged inhabitants into America at a rate almost double that of the preceding decade, and the flow was still increasing at the time the consensus was taken. So it is more than likely that when the next consensus is taken, it will be found that following 1910 there was an even greater flow from Spain, Italy, Hungary, Austria, Russia, Finland, and to other countries where the iron hand of economic and political tyrannies had crushed great populations into ignorance and want. These peoples have not been in the United States long enough to produce great families. The consensus of 1920 will in all probability tell a story of a greater and more serious problem than did the last. Over 1/4 of all the immigrants over 14 years of age, admitted during the 2 decades preceding 1910, were illiterate. Of the 8,398,000 who arrived in the 1900 to 1910 period, 2,238,000 could not read or write. There were 1,600,000 illiterate foreigners in the United States when the 1910 census was taken. Do these elements give promise of a better race? Are we doing anything genuinely constructive to overcome this situation? 2/3 of the white foreign stock in the United States live in cities. 4/5 of the populations of Chicago and New York are of this stock. More than 2/3 of the populations of Boston, Cleveland, Detroit, Buffalo, Pittsburgh, Milwaukee, Newark, Jersey City, Providence, Worcester, Scranton, Paterson, Fall River, Lowell, Cambridge, Bridgeport, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and San Francisco are of other than native white ancestry. Of the 50 principal cities of the United States, there are only 14 in which 50% of the population is of unmixed native white parentage. Only one state in the Union, North Carolina, has less than 1% of the white foreign stock. New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Dakotas, Montana, and Utah have more than 50% foreign stock. 11 states, including those on the Pacific coast, have from 35 to 50%. Maine, Ohio, and Kansas have from 25 to 35%. Maryland, Indiana, Missouri, and Texas have from 15 to 25%. These proportions are increasing rather than decreasing, owing to the extraordinarily high birth rate of the foreign strains. A special analysis of 1915 vital statistics for certain states in the World Almanac for 1918 shows that foreign-born mothers gave birth to nearly 62% of the children born in Connecticut, nearly 58% in Massachusetts, nearly 33% in Michigan, nearly 58% in Rhode Island, more than 43% in New Hampshire, more than 54% in New York, and more than 38% in Pennsylvania. All these figures, be it remembered, fail to include foreign stock of the second generation after landing. If the statistics for children who have native parents but foreign-born grandparents, or who have one foreign-born parent, were given, they would doubtless leave but a small percentage of births from stocks native to the soil for several generations. Immigrants or their children constitute the majority of workers employed in many of our industries. 7 out of 10 of those who work in our iron and steel industries are drawn from this class, says the National Geographic magazine of February 1917. 7 out of 10 of our bituminous coal miners belong to it. 3 out of 4 who work in packing towns were born abroad or are children of those who were born abroad. 4 out of 5 of those who make our silk goods, 7 out of 8 of those employed in woolen mills, 9 out of 10 of those who refine our petroleum, and 19 out of 20 of those who manufacture our sugar are immigrants or the children of immigrants. And it might have shown a similarly high percentage of those in the ready-made clothing industries, railway and public works construction of the less skilled sort, and a number of others. That these foreigners who have come in hordes have brought with them their ignorance of hygiene and modern ways of living, and that they are handicapped by religious superstitions is only too true. But they also bring in their hearts a desire for freedom from all the tyrannies that afflict the earth. They would not be here if they did not bear within them the hardihood of pioneers, a courage of no mean order. That they have simple faith that in America they will find equality, liberty, and an opportunity for a decent livelihood. And they have something else. The cell plasms of these people are freighted with the potentialities of the best in old world civilization. They come from lands rich in the traditions of courage, of art, music, letters, science, and philosophy. Americans no longer consider themselves cultured unless they have journeyed to these lands to find access to the treasures created by man and woman of this same blood. The immigrant brings the possibilities of all these things to our shores. But where is the opportunity to reproduce in the New World the cultures of the Old? What opportunities have we given to these people to enrich our civilization? We have greeted them as a lot of ignorant foreigners. We have shouted out, bustled, and kicked them. Our industries have taken advantage of their ignorance of the country's ways to take the toil in mills and mines and factories at starvation wages. We have herded them into slums to become diseased, to become social burdens, or to die. We have huddled them together like rabbits to multiply their numbers and their misery. Instead of saying that we Americanize them, we should confess that we animalize them. The only freedom we seem to have given them is the freedom to make heavier and more secure their chains. What hope is there for racial progress in this human material, treated more carelessly and brutally than the cheapest factory product? Nor are all our social handicaps bound up in the immigrant. There were in the United States, when the Federal Industrial Relations Committee finished its work in 1915, several million migratory workers, most of them white, many of them married but separated from their families, who were compelled, like themselves, to struggle. There were in 1910 more than 2,353,000 tenant farmers, 2/3 of whom lived and worked under the terrible conditions which the Industrial Relations Commission's report showed to prevail in the South and the Southwest. These tenant farmers, as the report showed, were always in want, and were compelled by the very terms of the prevailing tenant contracts to produce children who must go to the fields and do the work of adults. This census proved that this tendency was on the increase, the number of tenants in all but the New England and Middle Atlantic states having increased approximately 30% from 1900 to 1910. Moreover, there were in the United States in 1910 5,516,163 illiterates. Of these, 1,378,884 were of pure native white stock. In some states in the South, as much as 29% of the population is illiterate, many of these, of course, being Negroes. There is still another factor to be considered, a factor which, because of its great scope, is more ominous than any yet mentioned. This is the underpaid mass of workers in the United States, workers whose low wages are forcing them deeper into want each day. Let Senator Borah, not a radical, nor even a reformer, but a leader of the Republican Party, tell the story. 57% of the families in the United States have incomes of $800 or less, said he in a speech before the Senate, August 24, 1917. 70% of the families of our country have incomes of $1,000 or less. Tell me how a man so situated can have shelter for his family, how he can provide food and clothing. He is an industrial peon. His home is scant and pinched beyond the power of language to tell. He sees his wife and children on the ragged edge of hunger from week to week and month to month. If sickness comes, he faces suicide or crime. He cannot educate his children. He cannot fit them for citizenship. He cannot even fit them as soldiers to die for the country. It is the tragedy of our whole national life how these people live in such times as these. We have not yet gathered the fruits of such an industrial condition in this country. We have been saved thus far by reason of the newness of our national life, our vast public lands now almost exhausted, our great natural resources now fast being seized and held, but the hour of reckoning will come. Senator Borah was thinking doubtless of open revolution, of bloodshed and the destruction of property. In a far more terrible sense, the reckoning which he has referred to is already upon us. The ills we suffer as the result of the conditions now prevailing in the United States are appalling in their sum. It is these conditions that produce the 3,000,000 child laborers of the United States, child slaves who undergo hardships that blight them physically and mentally, leaving them fit only to produce human beings whose deficiencies and misfortunes will exceed their own. From these same elements living under these same conditions come the feeble-minded and other defectives. Just how many feeble-minded there are in the United States no one knows, because no attempt has ever been made to give public care to all of them, and families are more inclined to conceal than to reveal the mental defects of their members. Estimates vary from 350,000 at the present time to nearly 400,000 as early as 1890. Henry H. Goddard, Ph.D., of the Vineland, New Jersey Training School, being an authority for the latter statement. Only 34,137 of these unfortunates were under institutional care in the United States in 1916, the rest being free to propagate their kind, piling up public burdens for future generations. The feeble-minded are notoriously prolific in reproduction. The close relationship between poverty and ignorance and the production of the feeble-minded is shown by Ann Moore, Ph.D., in a report to the Public Education Association of New York in 1911. She found that an overwhelming proportion of the classified feeble-minded children in New York schools came from large families living in overcrowded slum conditions, and that only a small percentage were born of native parents. 60,000 prostitutes go and come anew each year in the United States. This army of unfortunates, as social workers and scientists testify, come from families living under like conditions of want. In the New York City schools alone in December 1916, 61% of the children were suffering from undernourishment, and 21% in immediate danger of it. These facts, also the result of the conditions outlined, were discovered by the City Bureau of Child Hygiene. Another item in the sordid list is that of venereal disease. In his pamphlet entitled The Venereal Diseases, issued in 1918, Dr. Herman M. Biggs, head of the New York State Department of Health, quoted authorities who gave estimates of the amount of syphilis and gonorrhea in the United States. One says that 60% of the men contract one disease or the other at some time. Another said that 40% of the population of New York City had syphilis, one of the most terrible of all maladies. Poverty, delayed marriage, prostitution, a brief and terrible chain accounts for the scourge. Finally, there is tuberculosis, bred by bad housing conditions and contributed to in frightful measure by poor food and unhealthy surroundings during the hours of employment. Dr. Frederick L. Hoffman, director of the National Association for the Study and Prevention of Tuberculosis and foremost statistical authority upon tuberculosis in the United States, says, "We know of 2 million tubercular persons in the United States." Does this picture horrify the reader? This is not the whole truth. A few scattered statistics lack the power to reflect the broken lives of overworked fathers, the ceaseless increasing pain of overburdened mothers, and the agony of childhood fighting its way against the handicaps of ill health, insufficient food, inadequate training, and stifling toil. Can we expect to remedy this situation by dismissing the problem of the submerged native elements with legislative palliatives or treating it with careless scorn? Do we better it by driving out the immigrant's heart the dream of liberty that brought him to our shores? Do we solve the problem by giving him, instead of an opportunity to develop his own culture, low wages, a home in the slums, and those pseudo-patriotic preachments which constitute our machine-made Americanization? Every detail of this sordid situation means a problem that must be solved before we can even clear the way for a greater race in America. Nor is there any hope of solving any of these problems if we continue to attack them in the usual way. Men have sentimentalized about them and legislated upon them. They have denounced them and they have applied reforms. But it has all been ridiculously, cruelly futile. This is the condition of things for which those stand who demand more and more children. Each child born under such conditions but makes them worse. Each child in its own person suffers the consequence of the intensified evils. If we are to develop in America a new race with a racial soul, we must keep the birth rate within the scope of our ability to understand as well as to educate. We must not encourage reproduction beyond our capacity to assimilate our numbers so as to make the coming generation into such physically fit, mentally capable, socially alert individuals as are the ideal of a democracy. The intelligence of a people is of slow evolutional development. It lags far behind the reproductive ability. It is far too slow to cope with conditions created by an increasing population unless that increase is carefully regulated. We must therefore not permit an increase in population that we are not prepared to care for to the best advantage, that we are not prepared to do justice to educationally and economically. We must popularize birth control thinking. We must not leave it haphazardly to be the privilege of the already privileged. We must put this means of freedom and growth into the hands of the masses. We must set motherhood free. We must give the foreign and submerged mother knowledge that will enable her to prevent bringing to birth children she does not want. We know that in each of these submerged and semi-submerged elements of the population there are rich factors of racial culture. Motherhood is the channel through which these cultures flow. Motherhood, when free to choose the father, free to choose the time and the number of children who shall result from the union, automatically works in wondrous ways. It refuses to bring forth weaklings, refuses to bring forth slaves, refuses to bear children who must live under the conditions described. It withholds the unfit, brings forth the fit, brings few children into homes where there is not sufficient to provide for them. Instinctively, it avoids all those things which multiply racial handicaps. Under such circumstances, we can hope that the melting pot will refine. We shall see that it will save the precious metals of racial culture, fused into an amalgam of physical perfection, mental strength, and spiritual progress. Such an American race, containing the best of all racial elements, could give to the world a vision and a leadership beyond our present imagination. End of Section 4. Chapter 4 of Woman in the New Race by Margaret Sanger. Two classes of woman. Thus far we have been discussing mainly one class in America, the workers. Most women who belong to workers' families have no accurate or reliable knowledge of contraceptives, and are, therefore, bringing children into the world so rapidly that they, and their families, and their class, are overwhelmed with numbers. Out of these numbers, as has been shown, have grown many of the burdens with which society in general is weighted. Out of them have come, also, the want, disease, hard living conditions, and general misery of the workers. The women of this class are the greatest sufferers of all. Not only do they bear the material hardships and deprivations in common with the rest of the family, but in the case of the mother these are intensified. It is the man and the child who have first call upon the insufficient amount of food. It is the man and the child who get the recreation, if there is any to be had, for the man's hours of labor are usually limited by law or by his labor union. It is the woman who suffers first from hunger, the woman whose clothing is least adequate, the woman who must work all hours even though she is not compelled, as in the case of millions, to go into a factory to add to her husband's scanty income. It is she, too, whose health breaks first, and most hopelessly, under the long hours of work, the drain of frequent childbearing, and often almost constant nursing of babies. There are no 8-hour laws to protect the mother against overwork and toil in the home, no laws to protect her against ill health and the disease of pregnancy and reproduction. In fact, there has been almost no thought or consideration given for the protection of the mother in the home of the working man. There are no general health statistics to tell the full story of the physical ills suffered by women as a result of too great reproductivity. But we get some light upon conditions through the statistics on maternal mortality compiled by Dr. Grace L. Meigs for the Children's Bureau of the United States Department of Labor. These figures do not include the deaths of women suffering from diseases complicated by pregnancy. In 1913, in this country, at least 15,000 women, it is estimated, died from conditions caused by childbirth. About 7,000 of these died from childbed fever, and the remaining 8,000 from diseases now known to be a great extent preventable or curable, says Dr. Meigs in her summary. Physicians and statisticians agree that these figures are a great underestimate. Think of it, the needless deaths of 15,000 women, a great underestimate. Yet even this number means that virtually every hour of the day and night 2 women die as a result of childbirth in the healthiest and supposedly the most progressive country in the world. It is apparent that Dr. Meigs leaves out of consideration the many thousands of deaths each year of women who become pregnant while suffering from tuberculosis. Dr. S. Adolphus Knopf, addressing the 44th Annual Convention of the American Public Health Association in Cincinnati in 1916, called attention to the fact that some authors hold that 65% of the women afflicted with tuberculosis, even when afflicted only in the relatively early and curable stages, die as the result of pregnancy which could have been avoided, and their lives saved, had they but known some means of prevention. Nor were syphilis, various kidney and heart disorders, and other diseases, often rendered fatal by pregnancy, taken into account by Dr. Meigs' survey. Still leaving out all of the hundreds of thousands of women who die because pregnancy has complicated serious diseases, Dr. Meigs finds that, in 1913, the death rate per 100,000 of the population from all conditions caused by childbirth was little lower than that from typhoid fever. This rate would be almost quadrupled if only the group of the population which can be affected, women of childbearing ages, were considered. In 1913, childbirth caused more deaths among women 15 to 44 years old than any disease except tuberculosis. From what sort of homes come these deaths from childbirth? Most of them occur in overcrowded dwellings where food, care, sanitation, nursing, and medical attention are inadequate. Where do we find most of the tuberculosis and much of the other disease which is aggravated by pregnancy? In the same sort of home. The deadly chain of misery is all too plain to anyone who takes the trouble to observe it. A woman of the working class marries, and with her husband lives in a degree of comfort upon his earnings. Her household duties are not beyond her strength. Then the children begin to come, 1, 2, 3, 4, possibly 5 or more. The earnings of the husband do not increase as rapidly as the family does. Food, clothing, and general comfort in the home grow less as the numbers of the family increase. The woman's work grows heavier, and her strength is less with each child. Possibly, probably, she has to go into a factory to add to her husband's earnings. There she toils, doing her housework at night. Her health goes, and the crowded conditions and lack of necessities in the home help to bring about disease, especially tuberculosis. Under the circumstances, the woman's chances of recovering from each succeeding childbirth grow less. Less, too, are the chances of the child surviving, as shown by tables in another chapter. Unwanted children, poverty, ill health, misery, death, these are the links in the chain, and they are common to most of the families in the class described in the preceding chapter. Nor is the full story of the woman's suffering yet told. Grievous as is her material condition, her spiritual deprivations are still greater. By the very fact of its existence, mother love demands its expression toward the child. By that same fact it becomes a necessary factor in the child's development. The mother of too many children, in a crowded home where want, ill health, and antagonism are perpetually created, is deprived of this simplest personal expression. She can give nothing to her child of herself or her personality. Training is impossible, and sympathetic guidance equally so. Instead, such a mother is tired, nervous, irritated, and ill-tempered, a deterrent often instead of a help to her children. Motherhood becomes a disaster, and childhood a tragedy. It goes without saying that this woman loses also all opportunity of personal expression outside of her home. She has neither a chance to develop social qualities nor to indulge in social pleasures. The feminine element in her, that spirit which blossoms forth now and then in women free from such burdens, cannot assert itself. She can contribute nothing to the well-being of the community. She is a breeding machine and a drudge. She is not an asset but a liability to her neighborhood, to her class, to her society. She can be nothing as long as she is denied means of limiting her family. In sharp contrast with these women who ignorantly bring forth large families, and who thereby enslave themselves, we find a few women who have 1, 2, or 3 children, or no children at all. These women, with the exception of the childless ones, live full rounded lives. They are found not only in the ranks of the rich and in the well-to-do, but in the ranks of labor as well. They have but one point of basic difference from their enslaved sisters: they are not burdened with the rearing of large families. We have no need to call upon the historian, the sociologist, nor the statistician for our knowledge in this situation. We meet it every day in the ordinary routine of our lives. The women who are the great teachers, the great writers, the artists, musicians, physicians, the leaders of public movements, the great suffragists, reformers, labor leaders, and revolutionaries, are those who are not compelled to give lavishly of their physical and spiritual strength in bearing and rearing large families. The situation is too familiar for discussion. Where a woman with a large family is contributing directly to the progress of her times or the betterment of social conditions, it is usually because she has sufficient wealth to employ trained nurses, governesses, and others who perform the duties necessary to child rearing. She is a rarity and is universally recognized as such. The women with small families, however, are free to make their choice of those social pleasures which are the right of every human being and necessary to each one's full development. They can be, and are, each according to her individual capacity, comrades and companions to their husbands, a privilege denied to the mother of many children. Theirs is the opportunity to keep abreast of the times, to make and cultivate a varied circle of friends, to seek amusements as suits their taste and means, to know the meaning of real recreation. All these things remain unrealized desires to the prolific mother. Women who have a knowledge of contraceptives are not compelled to make the choice between a maternal experience and a marred love life. They are not forced to balance motherhood against social and spiritual activities. Motherhood is for them to choose, as it should be for every woman to choose. Choosing to become mothers, they do not thereby shut themselves away from thorough companionship with their husbands, from friends, from culture, from all those manifold experiences which are necessary to the completeness and the joy of life. Fit mothers of the race are these, the courted comrades of the men they choose, rather than the slaves of slaves. For theirs is the magic power, the power of limiting their families to such numbers as will permit them to live full-rounded lives. Such lives are the expression of the feminine spirit, which is woman and all of her, not merely art, nor professional skill, nor intellect, but all that a woman is or may achieve. Chapter 5 of Woman and the New Race. The wickedness of creating large families. The most serious evil of our times is that of encouraging the bringing into the world of large families. The most immoral practice of the day is breeding too many children. These statements may startle those who have never made a thorough investigation of the problem. They are nevertheless well considered, and the truth of them is abundantly borne out by an examination of facts and conditions which are part of everyday experience or observation. The immorality of large families lies not only in their injury to the members of those families, but in their injury to society. If one were asked offhand to name the greatest evil of the day, one might, in the light of one's education by the newspapers, or by agitators, make any one of a number of replies. One might say prostitution, the oppression of labor, child labor, or war. Yet the poverty and neglect which drives a girl into prostitution usually has its source in a family too large to be properly cared for by the mother. If the girl is not actually subnormal because her mother bore too many children, and therefore the more likely to become a prostitute. Labor is oppressed because it is too plentiful. Wages go up and conditions improve when labor is scarce. Large families make plentiful labor, and they also provide the workers for the child labor factories as well as the armies of unemployed. That population, swelled by overbreeding, is a basic cause of war, we shall see in a later chapter. Without the large family, not one of these evils could exist to any considerable extent, much less to the extent that they exist today. The large family, especially the family too large to receive adequate care, is the one thing necessary to the perpetuation of these and other evils, and is therefore a greater evil than any one of them. First of the manifold immoralities involved in producing of a large family is the outrage upon the womanhood of the mother. If no mother bore children against her will or against her feminine instinct, there would be few large families. The average mother of a baby every year or two has been forced into unwilling motherhood,
so far as the later arrivals are concerned. It is not the less immoral when the power which compels enslavement is the church, state, or the propaganda of well-meaning patriots clamoring against race suicide. The wrong is as great as if the enslaving force were the unbridled passions of her husband. The wrong to the unwilling mother, deprived of her liberty and all opportunity of self-development, is in itself enough to condemn large families as immoral. The outrage upon the woman does not end there, however. Excessive childbearing is now recognized by the medical profession as one of the most prolific causes of ill health in women. There are in America hundreds of thousands of women in good health when they married, who have within a few years become a physical wreck, incapable of mothering their children, incapable of enjoying life. Every physician, writes Dr. W.M.J. Robinson in Birth Control or The Limitation of Offspring, knows that too frequent childbirth, nursing, and the sleepless nights that are required in bringing up a child exhaust the vitality of thousands of mothers, make them prematurely old, or turn them into chronic invalids. The effect of the large family upon the father is only less disastrous than it is upon the mother. The spectacle of the young man, happy in health, strength, and the prospect of a joyful love life, makes us smile in sympathy. But this same young man 10 years later is likely to present a spectacle as sorry as it is familiar. If he finds that the children come one after another at short intervals, so fast indeed that no matter how hard he works, nor how many hours, he cannot keep pace with their needs, the lover whom all the world loves will have been converted into a disheartened, threadbare incompetent, whom all the world pities or despises. Instead of being the happy, competent father, supporting 1 or 2 children as they should be supported, he is the frantic struggler against the burden of 5 or 6, with the tragic prospect of several more. The ranks of the physically weakened, mentally dejected, and spiritually hopeless young fathers of large families attest all too strongly the immorality of the system. If its effects upon the mother and the wage-earning father were not enough to condemn the large family as an institution, its effects upon the child would make the case against it conclusive. In the United States, some 300,000 children under 1 year of age die each 12 months. Approximately 90% of these deaths are directly or indirectly due to malnutrition, to other disease conditions resulting from poverty, or to excessive childbearing by the mother. The direct relationship between the size of the wage earner's family and the death of children less than 1 year old has been revealed by a number of studies of the infant death rate. One of the clearest of these was that made by Arthur Geisler among minors and cited by Dr. Alfred Plotz before the First International Eugenic Congress. Footnote: Problems in Eugenics, London, 1913. Taking 26,000 births from unselected marriages and omitting families having 1 and 2 children, Geisler got this result. Deaths during first year: first-born children, 23%; second-born children, 20%; third-born children, 21%; fourth-born children, 23%; fifth-born children, 26%; sixth-born children, 29%; seventh-born children, 31%; eighth-born children, 33%; ninth-born children, 36%; tenth-born children, 41%; 11th-born children, 51%; 12th-born children, 60%. Thus we see that the second and third children have a very good chance to live through the first year. Children arriving later have less and less chance until the 12th has hardly any chance at all to live 12 months. This does not complete the case, however, for those who care to go farther into the subject will find that many of those who live for a year die before they reach the age of 5. Many, perhaps, will think it idle to go farther in demonstrating the immorality of large families, but since there is still an abundance of proof at hand, it may be offered for the sake of those who find difficulty in adjusting old-fashioned ideas to the facts. The most merciful thing that the large family does to one of its infant members is to kill it. The same factors which create the terrible infant mortality rate, and which swell the death rate of children between the ages of 1 and 5, operate even more extensively to lower the health rate of the surviving members. Moreover, the overcrowded homes of large families reared in poverty further contribute to this condition. Lack of medical attention is still another factor, so that the child who must struggle for health in competition with other members of a closely packed family has still great difficulties to meet after its poor constitution and malnutrition have been accounted for. The probability of a child handicapped by a weak constitution, an overcrowded home, inadequate food and care, and possibly a deficient mental equipment, winding up in prison or an almshouse is too evident for comment. Every jail, hospital for the insane, reformatory, and institution for the feeble-minded cries out against the evils of too prolific breeding among wage workers. We shall see when we come to consider the relation of voluntary motherhood to the rights of labor and to the prevention of war that the large family of the worker makes possible his oppression, and that it is also the chief cause of such human holocausts as the one just closed after the 4½ bloodiest years in history. No such extended consideration is necessary to indicate from what source the young slaves in the child labor factories come. They come from large impoverished families, from families in which the older children must put their often feeble strength to the task of supporting the younger. The immorality of bringing large families into the world is recognized by those who are combating the child labor evil. Mary Alden Hopkins, writing in Harper's Weekly in 1915, quotes Owen R. Lovejoy, General Secretary of the National Child Labor Committee, as follows: "How many are too many? Any more than the mother can look after and the father make a living for. Under present conditions, as soon as there are too many children for the father to feed, some of them go to work in the mine or factory or store or mill nearby. In doing this, they not only injure their tender, growing bodies, but indirectly they drag down the father's wage. The home becomes a mere rendezvous for the nightly gathering of bodies numb with weariness and minds drunk with sleep. And if they survive the factory, they marry to perpetuate and multiply their ignorance, weakness, and diseases." What have large families to do with prostitution? Ask anyone who has studied the problem. The size of the family has a direct bearing on the lives of thousands of girls who are living in prostitution. Poverty, lack of care and training during adolescence, overcrowded housing conditions which accompany large families are universally recognized as causes of waywardness in girls. Social workers have cried out in vain against these conditions, pointing to their inevitable results. In the foreword to Downward Paths, A. Maud Royden says, "Intimately connected with this aspect of the question is that of home and housing, especially of the child. The age at which children are first corrupted is almost incredibly early, until we consider the nature of the surroundings in which they grow up. Insufficient space, overcrowding, the herding together of all ages and both sexes, these things break down the barriers of natural modesty and reserve. Where decency is practically impossible, unchastity will follow, and follow almost as a matter of course. And the child who has no place to play, except in the street, who lacks mother care, whose chief emotional experience is the longing for the necessities of life? We know too well the end of the sorry tale. The forlorn figures of the shadows where lurk the girls who sell themselves that they may eat and be clothed, rise up to damn the moral dogmatists, who mouth their sickening exhortations to the wives and mothers of the workers to breed, breed, breed. The evidence is conclusive as regards the large family of the wage worker. Social workers, physicians, and reformers cry out to stop the breeding of these who must exist in want until they become permanent members of the ranks of the unfit. But what of the family of the wealthy or the merely well-to-do? It is among these classes that we find the women who have attained to voluntary motherhood. It is to these classes, too, that the race suicide alarmists have from time to time addressed specifically emphasized pleas for more children. The advocates of more prolific breeding urge that these same women, who have more intelligence, better health, more time to care for children, and more means to support them. They therefore declare that it is the duty of such women to populate the land with strong, healthy, intelligent offspring, to bear children in great numbers. It is time to expose the sheer foolishness of this argument. The first absurdity is that the women who are in comfortable circumstances could continue to be cultured and of social value if they were the mothers of large families. Neither could they maintain their present standard of health nor impart it to their children. While it is true that they have resources at their command which ease the burden of childbearing and child-rearing immeasurably, it is also true that the wealthy mother, as well as the poverty-stricken mother, must give from her own system certain elements which it takes time to replace. Excessive childbearing is harder on the woman who lacks care than on the one who does not, but both alike must give their bodies time to recover from the strain of childbearing. If the women of fortunate circumstances gave ear to the demand of masculine race-suicide fanatics, they could within a few years be down to the condition of their sisters, who lack time to cultivate their talents and intellects. A vigorous, intelligent, fruitfully cultured motherhood is all but impossible if no restriction is placed by that motherhood upon the number of children. Footnote A. Interesting and perhaps surprising light is thrown upon the origin of the term race-suicide by the following quotation from an article by Harold Bolce in Cosmopolitan, New York, for May 1909. The sole effect of prolificacy is to fill the cemeteries with tiny graves, sacrifices of the innocents to the Moloch of immoderate maternity. Thus insists Edward A. Ross, professor of sociology in the University of Wisconsin, and he protests against the dwarfing of women and the cheapening of men as regards the restriction of the birth rate as a movement at bottom salutary and its evils minor, transient, and curable. This is virile gospel, and particularly significant coming from the teacher who invented the term race suicide, which many have erroneously attributed to Mr. Roosevelt. Wage workers and salaried people have a vital interest in the size of the families of those better situated in life. Large families among the rich are immoral, not only because they invade the natural right of woman to the control of her own body, to self-development, and to self-expression, but because they are oppressive to the poorer elements of society. If the upper and middle classes of society had kept pace with the poorer elements of society in reproduction during the past 50 years, the working class today would be forced down to the level of the Chinese, whose wage standard is said to be a few handfuls of rice a day. If these considerations are not enough to halt the masculine advocate of large families, who reminds us of the days of our mothers and grandmothers, let it be remembered that bearing and rearing 6 or 8 children today is a far different matter from what it was in the generations just preceding. Physically and nervously, the woman of today is not fitted to bear children as frequently as was her mother and her mother's mother. The high tension of modern life and the complicating of woman's everyday existence have doubtless contributed to this result. And who of us can say, until a careful scientific investigation is made, how much the rapid development of tuberculosis and other grave diseases, even among the well-nurtured, may be due to the depletion of the physical capital of the unborn by the too prolific child-breeding of preceding generations of mothers. The immorality of bringing into being a large family is a wrong-doing shared by 3, the mother, the father, and society. Upon all 3 falls the burden of guilt. It may be said for the mother and father that they are usually ignorant. What shall be said of society? What shall be said of us who permit outworn laws and customs to persist in piling up the appalling sum of public expense, misery, and spiritual degradation? The indictment against the large and wanted family is written in human woe. Who, in the light of intelligent understanding, shall have the brazenness to stand up and defend it? One thing we know, the woman who has escaped the chains of too great reproductivity will never again wear them. The birth rate of the wealthy and upper classes will never appreciably rise. The woman of these classes is free of her most oppressive bonds. Being free, we have a right to expect much of her. We expect her to give still greater expression to her feminine spirit. We expect her to enrich the intellectual, artistic, moral, and spiritual life of the world. We expect her to demolish old systems of morals, a degenerate prudery, dark age religious concepts, laws that enslave women by denying them the knowledge of their bodies and information as to contraceptives. These must go to the scrap heap of vicious cast-off things. Hers is the power to send them there. Shall we look to her to strike the first blow which shall wrench her sisters from the grip of the dead hand of the past? End of chapter 5.